In the winter of 1943, as the frozen ruins of Battle of Stalingrad smoldered under a gray sky, thousands of exhausted German soldiers made a decision they had once believed impossible. They surrendered. For months they had been told that capture meant humiliation, starvation, or execution. Nazi propaganda had painted the enemy as ruthless and vengeful. To be taken prisoner, they were warned, was worse than death. Yet hunger, frostbite, and relentless Soviet artillery had broken even the most disciplined units. When the encircled Sixth Army finally laid down its arms, nearly 90,000 German troops marched into captivity. Most would never return home. But elsewhere, on other fronts, a different fate awaited thousands of German soldiers, one that would carry them across an ocean to a country they had been taught to hate. The turning point in the West came after the Allied landings in France on June 6, 1944, the day history would remember as Normandy landings. As American, British, and Canadian forces pushed inland, German defensive lines began to fracture. Entire battalions found themselves surrounded, supply lines collapsed, air superiority belonged entirely to the Allies. For many young German soldiers, some barely 18, the war had shifted from bold advance to desperate survival. Private Karl Müller, a fictional name representing countless real accounts preserved in wartime archives, had joined the Wehrmacht at 17. He believed he was defending his homeland from destruction. By August 1944, near the Falaise Pocket in France, his unit was trapped. Allied aircraft strafed the roads by day, artillery thundered by night. The wounded lay unattended in roadside ditches. Karl later recalled that surrender did not feel like cowardice, it felt like relief. When American troops approached his position, he raised his hands slowly, expecting a rifle butt or worse. Instead, he was searched, given water, and directed to sit by the roadside with dozens of other prisoners. The Americans looked different from what he expected, relaxed, confident, well-fed. They handed out cigarettes. Some even attempted awkward German phrases. It was the first crack in the image he had been given of the enemy. By late 1944, tens of thousands of German prisoners were in Allied custody. After the collapse of German forces in North Africa in 1943, particularly following the surrender of General Rommel's Africa Corps, the United States and Britain faced a logistical challenge: what to do with so many prisoners. Britain, under constant threat of air attack and already burdened with POWs, lacked space. The Soviet Union had no interest in sending captured Germans westward. So the United States made a strategic decision: transport large numbers of German POWs across the Atlantic Ocean to camps inside America itself. The journey from battlefield to captivity followed a strict process. Captured soldiers were first disarmed and searched. Officers were separated from enlisted men. They were interrogated briefly for intelligence value, troop positions, unit strengths, morale. Most ordinary soldiers had little information to give. After registration, they were sent to temporary holding enclosures in France or Belgium. Many expected mistreatment. Instead, they were issued rations comparable to American troops in accordance with the Geneva Convention, which both Germany and the United States had signed. Under its rules, prisoners were to be protected from violence, provided shelter, food, and medical care. For some Germans, this adherence to international law was deeply confusing. They had witnessed or heard of brutal conditions in camps run by the Nazi regime. They assumed retaliation would follow. But the Americans were pragmatic. Treating prisoners well encouraged surrender. It also set a standard they hoped would protect American POWs held by Germany. By early 1945, as the Allied armies crossed the Rhine River and entered the German heartland, mass surrenders became common.
Entire units laid down their weapons rather than face annihilation. At Remagen, after U.S. forces captured the Ludendorff Bridge intact, thousands more German troops were taken prisoner in a matter of days. One American officer later wrote that processing prisoners sometimes felt like managing a city: endless lines of gray uniforms, tired faces, hollow eyes. Among them were farmers from Bavaria, factory workers from Hamburg, university students from Berlin. Many had never traveled beyond their hometowns before the war. Now they were standing in muddy fields under foreign guard, uncertain whether they would ever see Germany again. Rumors spread quickly among the captives. Some claimed they would be sent to labor camps in Canada. Others whispered about harsh prisons in England. Few imagined they would be transported to the United States, a land portrayed in Nazi newsreels as decadent and racially divided, weak despite its industrial power. The idea of America existed in their minds as myth, not reality. In holding camps near the French coast, German POWs waited for transport. Red Cross representatives occasionally visited. Letters home were permitted under supervision. For many soldiers, writing that first message, "I am alive," was the most emotional moment since their capture. There was shame, certainly. In the ideology of the Third Reich, surrender was dishonor. But by 1945, survival outweighed pride. American guards often observed something unexpected. Discipline remained strong among the prisoners. They formed internal hierarchies. Officers maintained authority. Some even enforced military salutes within the wire. The war, at least psychologically, had not ended for them. Yet beneath the surface, doubt had begun to grow. They had seen American equipment up close: the endless trucks, the abundance of fuel, the superior air power. They had eaten white bread and real coffee provided by their captors. They had noticed that American soldiers joked freely with their superiors, something rare in the rigid German command structure. If this was the enemy, it did not match the monster described by Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine. As winter turned to spring in 1945, trains carried groups of German POWs westward to French ports. There, massive transport ships waited. Many prisoners believed they were heading to Britain. Few realized they were about to cross the Atlantic Ocean. For Private Karl Müller and thousands like him, the war they had known, the mud, the explosions, the fear of sudden death, was over. In its place stood uncertainty, captivity, distance from home. But none of them could have imagined that the most unusual sight of their lives was not behind them on the battlefield. It was waiting across the ocean, and soon they would see it with their own eyes.
By the time the German prisoners reached the French ports in early 1945, most of them believed they understood their fate. They assumed they would remain somewhere in Europe, perhaps in Britain, perhaps in France, until the war ended. Few imagined they were about to travel farther than they had ever dreamed possible. At docks in places like Le Havre and Marseille, long gray transport ships waited in silence. The vessels had once carried American troops into war. Now they would carry German soldiers away from it. The United States had made a calculated decision. With Britain overcrowded and supply lines secure across the Atlantic, America would house large numbers of German prisoners on its own soil. It was a logistical solution and a strategic one. The ocean itself was a barrier. Escape would be nearly impossible. The prisoners were marched up gangways in long columns, guarded but not brutalized. Each man carried little more than a blanket roll and a few personal effects. Many still wore worn Wehrmacht uniforms. Some had not shaved in weeks. Below deck they found tiered bunks stacked tightly together. The air smelled of oil, salt water, and bodies packed into confined space. Yet compared to the Eastern Front, it felt almost orderly. The Atlantic crossing was still dangerous.
German U-boats had once terrorized these waters, but by 1945, the Battle of the Atlantic had largely turned in favor of the Allies. Convoys were heavily escorted. American naval power dominated the sea. For the prisoners, the voyage felt surreal. Private Carl Muller, like many real POWs who later wrote memoirs, remembered the moment the shoreline of Europe disappeared behind gray mist. For the first time in his life, he was leaving the continent of his birth. He did not know when or if he would return. Days aboard ship settled into routine. Prisoners were counted every morning. Meals were basic but sufficient. Powdered eggs, bread, soup, coffee. To their surprise, portions were consistent. No one was deliberately starved. Some prisoners stood silently on deck when permitted, staring at the endless water. Others argued politics in hushed tones. Hardline Nazis insisted Germany still had secret weapons that would change the course of the war. More realistic soldiers remained quiet. They had seen too much. American guards, many barely older than the men they watched, sometimes attempted conversation. A few spoke broken German. Some prisoners spoke basic English learned in school before the war. Words like Chicago, New York, and Texas drifted through conversations, distant names that sounded almost fictional. At night, the ship creaked against the waves. The Atlantic wind cut sharply across the decks. In crowded bunks below, prisoners whispered rumors. Where are they taking us? Canada. No, England. Perhaps Africa. Then someone mentioned a possibility that seemed absurd. America. The idea carried strange weight. For years, Nazi propaganda had portrayed the United States as materialistic and morally corrupt, powerful but decadent, racially divided, lacking discipline. German newspapers mocked American culture as shallow. Hollywood films were dismissed as foolish entertainment. Yet those same newspapers could not hide one truth. American industry was enormous. Many German soldiers had seen the results firsthand. Endless convoys of trucks, aircraft in numbers that darkened the sky, supplies that never seemed to run out. Some began to wonder what kind of country could produce such abundance. After nearly 2 weeks at sea, the atmosphere shifted. The weather grew milder. The air felt different, less sharp, more humid. One morning, prisoners were ordered above deck in small groups. On the horizon stood a faint vertical shape rising from the water. As the ship approached New York Harbor, the outline became unmistakable. The Statue of Liberty. The symbol meant different things to different men. To American guards, it represented freedom. To the German prisoners, it was something far more complicated. They were not arriving as immigrants seeking opportunity. They were arriving as defeated soldiers of a collapsing regime. Yet the sight was overwhelming. Behind the statue, the skyline of New York City rose like nothing they had ever seen. Steel towers stretched into the clouds. Bridges spanned wide rivers. Tugboats moved efficiently through busy waters. For men raised in medieval towns and rural villages, it looked like the future. Carl later described the moment as more shocking than artillery fire, not because it was violent, but because it contradicted everything he had been told. This was not a starving, chaotic nation. It was vast, organized, wealthy beyond imagination. Other ships docked at ports like Norfolk or Baltimore, where similar scenes unfolded. Civilians stood at a distance, watching silently as columns of German prisoners disembarked. There were no mobs, no beatings, just controlled efficiency. The prisoners were processed again, photographed, registered, issued identification numbers. Some were vaccinated. Medical inspections were thorough. Those too ill were treated in military hospitals. Then came another surprise. Instead of being crammed into dark prison cells, many were placed on trains. As the trains moved inland, the prisoners stared through barred windows at the American landscape. endless farmland, small towns with neat wooden houses, automobiles parked along wide roads, billboards advertising products they had never heard of. In the South and Midwest, fields stretched to the horizon. In the West, deserts shimmered under open sky. The scale of the country was difficult to comprehend. Some prisoners expected hostility from civilians. Instead, they often encountered curiosity. At brief stops, local Americans would watch quietly. Children pointed. Occasionally someone waved, unsure whether to treat the moment as spectacle or solemn duty. The guards remained alert, but tension was minimal. Escape into an unfamiliar land, thousands of kilometers from home, was unlikely. Inside the train cars, conversations changed tone. The men were no longer discussing secret weapons or miracle offensives. They were asking different questions. How can a country this rich lose a war? Perhaps we never had a chance. The psychological shift had begun. For many of these German soldiers, the most unusual sight was not the Statue of Liberty alone. It was abundance without visible destruction. No bombed-out factories, no shattered rail lines, no hunger in the streets. America had fought a global war without experiencing invasion on its mainland. By the time the trains slowed at remote stations in Texas, Arizona, Iowa, or Oklahoma, the prisoners understood one thing clearly. They were farther from home than they had ever imagined possible, and the country they had been taught to despise did not look like an enemy at all. It looked like a different world. Behind barbed wire in that distant land, their understanding of the war and of themselves was about to change even more.
When the trains finally stopped, the German prisoners stepped down into landscapes that felt almost unreal. Some arrived in the dry heat of Texas, others in the open plains of the Midwest, still others in the deserts of Arizona. Guard towers stood above neat rows of wooden barracks. Barbed wire fences traced clean boundaries around compounds that looked more like small military bases than prisons. For many, this was their first close look at America beyond the harbor skyline. One of the largest facilities was Camp Hearn in Texas. Camp Hearn, but it was only one of more than 500 main camps and branch camps spread across the United States. At the height of the war, over 370,000 German prisoners were held on American soil. The first surprise came quickly. The barracks were wooden but solid. Each man was issued a cot, blankets, and basic supplies. There were mess halls, medical clinics, even small libraries. Under the rules of the Geneva Convention, prisoners were entitled to food, shelter, and humane treatment equivalent to that of the captor's own troops. Many Germans had expected punishment. Instead, they were given routine. Each morning began with roll call. American guards counted carefully, rifles slung but rarely raised. After breakfast, often including white bread, coffee, potatoes, and sometimes meat, work details were assigned. The United States faced severe labor shortages. Millions of American men were overseas fighting. Farms lacked workers. Timber operations slowed. Railroads needed maintenance crews. German POWs filled the gap. Under guard, they harvested cotton in Texas fields, cut pulpwood in southern forests, picked vegetables in the Midwest, and worked in canneries and factories. They were paid small wages in camp scrip, not American dollars, but coupons they could use inside camp canteens. The work was physical but familiar. Many prisoners had been farmers before the war. Compared to frontline combat, it felt almost peaceful. Private Carl Mueller found himself assigned to a farm detail outside a small Texas town. The sun was relentless, the soil dry and stubborn, but there were no artillery shells, no sudden screams in the night. What unsettled him most was not hardship, it was normalcy. American civilians watched them cautiously at first, yet over time, simple human interactions developed.
Farmers sometimes offered extra water during hot days. A few exchanged brief words in broken German or English. Some prisoners were stunned to see African American and white workers laboring in the same fields, though not always treated equally. It challenged the racial ideology they had been taught. Inside the camps, life developed its own rhythm. Soccer matches were organized between barracks. Some camps formed orchestras using handmade instruments. Others staged theatrical performances. The U.S. military allowed limited educational programs. Books in German were provided, including classics by Goethe and Schiller. There were even newspapers printed in German for the prisoners, carefully screened for content, but informative about world events. And then there was the food. In bombed-out German cities, civilians were surviving on ration cards and thin soup. In American POW camps, prisoners often received more calories than civilians back home. Some gained noticeable weight. The abundance was undeniable. Meat portions were steady. Fresh vegetables appeared regularly. Coffee was plentiful. Cigarettes, a prized currency among soldiers, were distributed weekly. Carl later admitted that he felt guilty the first time he realized he was eating better as a prisoner than his family likely was in Germany. But not everything inside the wire was calm. Among the prisoners were devoted Nazis, men who remained fiercely loyal to Hitler, even as the right crumbled. They formed tight-knit groups, enforcing ideological discipline. Those suspected of doubting the regime were sometimes threatened or beaten. In a few documented cases, anti-Nazi prisoners were murdered by fellow Germans inside American camps. It shocked U.S. authorities, who had assumed captivity would dissolve political tensions. Instead, the war's ideology had followed them across the ocean. American intelligence officers began quietly separating hardline extremists from others. They identified outspoken Nazis and transferred them to stricter compounds. Meanwhile, they encouraged educational discussions about democracy, economics, and world events. Some prisoners resisted. Others listened carefully. For many, the greatest shock was not comfort, it was fairness. When a prisoner violated camp rules, punishment was formal and documented. There were no arbitrary executions. Medical care was available. Mail from home, though censored, was delivered when possible. In the evenings, Carl would sit outside his barrack and watch the Texas sunset. The sky turned deep orange, stretching endlessly beyond the fence. He once confessed to a fellow prisoner that he had never imagined America could be beautiful. He had imagined factories, crime, moral decay. Instead, he saw quiet farmland and open space. Months passed. News filtered in slowly. By April 1945, rumors of Berlin's encirclement spread through the camp. Then came confirmation. Hitler was dead. For some prisoners, it felt like the collapse of a religion. For others, it felt like a release from a burden they had carried too long. When Germany officially surrendered in May 1945, celebrations erupted outside the camps across America. Fireworks lit up distant towns. Church bells rang. Inside the wire, the reaction was subdued. The war was over, but they were still prisoners, thousands of miles from home. And now a new uncertainty began. What would Germany look like when they returned? Would there be homes to return to? Would their families even be alive? In the quiet of American camps, under guard towers and wide skies, German soldiers began confronting a truth more powerful than defeat. The enemy they had feared had treated them with restraint. The nation they had been told was weak had proven overwhelming. And captivity, strange, structured, and unexpectedly humane, was reshaping how they understood both America and themselves. Beyond the fences, the world was rebuilding. Inside, so were they.
By the summer of 1945, the guns in Europe had fallen silent. Germany had surrendered. The Third Reich had collapsed into rubble. But inside the American prisoner of war camps, the war was not entirely over. It had simply changed form.
Behind barbed wire, a different battle was unfolding, one not fought with rifles or artillery, but with belief, loyalty, and fear. Among the hundreds of thousands of German POWs held in the United States were men who remained fiercely devoted to Adolf Hitler and National Socialism. Even after his death, even after Berlin fell, they clung to the ideology that had shaped their youth. For them, surrender was temporary, loyalty was permanent. In many camps, informal hierarchies formed quickly. Senior officers retained authority, non-commissioned officers enforced discipline. And within those structures, hardline Nazis often positioned themselves as guardians of true German honor. Private Karl Müller began noticing subtle changes in behavior after news of Germany's defeat reached the camp. Some prisoners removed insignia from their uniforms and quietly admitted the war had been a mistake. Others, however, grew more rigid. They held secret meetings inside barracks at night. They monitored conversations. They warned fellow prisoners not to betray the fatherland by speaking positively about America. Those suspected of anti-Nazi views could face intimidation, sometimes violence. In several documented cases across U.S. camps, prisoners accused of collaboration or disloyalty were beaten. A few were killed by fellow Germans in makeshift camp justice incidents. These murders shocked American authorities, who had initially underestimated how deeply ideology still ran among the captives. The United States military responded carefully. Rather than applying collective punishment, they began identifying the most extreme individuals. Informants quietly reported names. Prisoners who openly praised Hitler or threatened others were transferred to more secure camps with stricter oversight. But repression alone would not solve the problem. American officials understood that these men would eventually return to Germany. The question was, what kind of Germany would they help rebuild? Thus began one of the most unusual experiments of the war, re-education behind barbed wire. The goal was not humiliation, it was exposure. Camp authorities introduced discussion groups, screened carefully selected newsreels, and distributed newspapers that reported on the Nuremberg trials and the discovery of concentration camps. Many prisoners had heard rumors of atrocities, few had seen documented evidence. When footage from liberated camps was shown, reactions were mixed. Some prisoners stared in silence, others insisted the images were Allied fabrications. A few walked out in anger. Karl remembered sitting on a wooden bench during one such screening. He felt disbelief at first, then unease. He had never personally witnessed mass murder. He had believed Germany was fighting a defensive war. The scale of the crimes presented on the screen did not fit that narrative. It forced a painful question. What had they truly been fighting for? In addition to political information, educational programs expanded. English language classes were offered. Lectures on American government and constitutional law were organized. Prisoners learned about separation of powers, elections, and civil rights. Some attended simply to escape boredom. Others grew genuinely curious. American guards noticed generational differences. Younger prisoners, especially those drafted late in the war, were often more open to new ideas. Older career soldiers tended to remain guarded and skeptical. There were also moments of unexpected humanity. In agricultural work details, prisoners interacted more closely with American civilians. Farmers sometimes spoke candidly about their sons fighting overseas. They discussed rationing, war bonds, and loss. These conversations were not lectures, they were personal stories. For some German POWs, this was the first time they encountered ordinary Americans as individuals rather than propaganda images.
Carl once worked alongside an elderly Texas farmer whose son had died in the Pacific. The farmer did not shout, he did not blame, he simply said, "War takes everyone's boys." The simplicity of that statement lingered. Inside the camps, ideological divisions slowly softened for many, though never for all. By late 1945, with Germany divided into occupation zones and cities like Berlin reduced to ruins, the reality of defeat became undeniable. Letters from home described destroyed neighborhoods, missing relatives, hunger, and uncertainty. The myth of inevitable German victory had dissolved completely. Some prisoners began imagining a different future, one not built on conquest but on rebuilding. American authorities observed measurable change. Camp newspapers reported decreasing pro-Nazi incidents. Attendance at educational programs increased. Discussions shifted from military strategy to reconstruction and employment. Yet transformation was gradual and deeply personal. For Carl, the most powerful shift was not political, but psychological. Captivity had forced him to see the world beyond slogans and uniforms. He had experienced an enemy who did not match the caricature drawn by propaganda. He did not suddenly become American in outlook. He remained German, but his certainty, the rigid, unquestioned belief of his youth, had cracked. Behind barbed wire, thousands of miles from home, many German POWs were undergoing similar internal reckonings. The war had been fought with tanks and bombs, but its aftermath would be decided in mines. By 1946, discussions in Washington turned toward repatriation. The United States would not hold the prisoners forever. Europe needed labor to rebuild shattered infrastructure. Germany, though defeated, needed its men back. As rumors of eventual return spread through the camps, emotions grew complex. There was relief and anxiety. They would soon leave the strange land of abundance and order. They would return to uncertainty, to ruins, to a homeland divided by occupying powers. For some, America had become a place of quiet transformation. For others, it remained foreign and misunderstood. But one truth was undeniable. Behind American barbed wire, the final battle of the war had not been about territory. It had been about belief. And for many German POWs, that battle had changed them forever.
By late 1946, more than a year after the war had ended, the German prisoners in America were still waiting. The fighting was over. Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered unconditionally in May 1945. Yet for hundreds of thousands of POWs, captivity continued, not out of punishment, but necessity. Europe was shattered. Railways were destroyed. Bridges lay twisted in rivers. Entire industrial regions were silent. Across occupied Germany, cities like Berlin, Hamburg, and Cologne were fields of rubble. Millions were homeless. Food shortages were severe. The Allies needed labor to rebuild. For that reason, many German POWs in the United States were not immediately repatriated. Instead, they continued working, harvesting crops, cutting timber, repairing infrastructure. Officially, they were still prisoners of war. Unofficially, they had become part of the American wartime economy. Private Carl Mueller had now spent more than a year behind American barbed wire. The guard towers no longer felt threatening. The daily routines were predictable. He spoke basic English. He understood American slang. He had even learned to play baseball, though he still preferred football, soccer. Then, in early 1947, his name appeared on a transfer list. Repatriation had begun. The announcement stirred mixed emotions across the camp. Some men cheered, others fell silent. America had been strange, unexpected, sometimes even humane.
Germany, in contrast, was unknown. What would they return to? The journey home began much like the one that had brought them across the ocean. Trains carried them to East Coast ports. Ships waited once more in the harbor, but this time the direction was reversed. As the American coastline faded behind them, Carl stood on deck and tried to process what the past 2 years had meant. He had arrived believing America was corrupt and weak. He was leaving having witnessed its industrial power, its legal structure, its relative abundance, and its contradictions. He had expected cruelty. He had experienced restraint. Weeks later, the ships docked in European ports, often in France or Belgium first. From there, former prisoners were handed over to British or French authorities before gradually being sent into occupied Germany. When Carl finally crossed back into his homeland, the shock was deeper than anything he had experienced in New York Harbor. Cities were broken. Train stations stood roofless. Churches were blackened by fire. Children played among piles of brick that had once been homes. Food lines stretched down streets that no longer had functioning shops. The Germany he had left no longer existed. His family's house had survived partially, though windows were shattered and one wall damaged. His mother looked older than he remembered. His younger brother, once a schoolboy, now worked clearing rubble for ration coupons. Conversations were cautious at first. Many families avoided speaking openly about the war. There was shame, there was grief, there was exhaustion. Carl soon realized that his experience in America gave him a perspective few around him shared. He had seen a functioning democracy at work. He had observed open political discussion. He had witnessed racial tensions and social inequalities, but also economic opportunity and public debate without secret police. In the American camps, he had read newspapers describing the trials of Nazi leaders in Nuremberg. He had seen evidence of crimes committed in the name of the regime he once served. Returning home, he understood that rebuilding Germany required more than bricks and steel. It required confronting truth. Not all former POWs reacted the same way. Some returned bitter, convinced they had been defeated by overwhelming numbers rather than flawed ideology. Others embraced change more quickly. Many simply focused on survival. Yet, historians later noted an interesting pattern. A significant number of German POWs held in the United States adapted relatively smoothly into post-war democratic West Germany. Exposure had mattered. By 1948, nearly all German POWs had been repatriated from America. The camps in Texas, Arizona, and the Midwest were dismantled. Guard towers came down, barbed wire was removed, fields returned to quiet farmland. In time, the story faded from public memory, but for the men who had lived it, the experience lingered. Some former prisoners chose an unexpected path. They immigrated back to the United States years later. Having learned the language and glimpsed the culture during captivity, they applied for visas in the 1950s and 1960s. They returned not as soldiers, but as workers, husbands, fathers. For them, America was no longer an enemy. It was an opportunity. Carl never emigrated. He remained in Germany, married, raised children, and worked as a mechanic in a rebuilding economy that would eventually become one of Europe's strongest. Yet he rarely spoke of the war in terms of battles. When asked by his son what surprised him most about America, he did not mention skyscrapers or endless highways. He said this: "We were taught to fear monsters. Instead, we found people." The journey of German POWs to the United States remains one of the lesser-known chapters of the Second World War. Over 370,000 German soldiers were held in America during the conflict. Most returned home quietly. There were no dramatic uprisings, no mass escapes, no revenge. only time and perspective. For many of those men, the most unusual sight was not the Statue of Liberty rising from the harbor. It was the realization that the world was more complex than propaganda allowed. They had crossed an ocean as enemies. They returned across it as witnesses to something entirely different. And in that quiet transformation, history left one of its most unexpected legacies.